The morning my parents tried to steal my inheritance, they were wearing their best clothes. My father had on the navy blazer he reserved for country club dinners. My mother wore pearl earrings and carried a leather handbag that cost more than my first month's rent in the apartment where I raised my son alone. They walked into that courthouse like they owned it, calm, rehearsed, and absolutely certain they had already won. They hadn't seen me in 20 years. Not since the night they handed me $100 check in a plastic grocery bag and told me to disappear. I was 16 years old. I was 3 months pregnant. And I was standing on their porch in late October wind that felt like it wanted to cut straight through to my spine. They didn't even say goodbye. So you can imagine the look on their attorney's face when he walked past them in the aisle, stopped at the front of the courtroom, and said directly to me, "Good morning, Judge." My mother's pearl earrings didn't move, but the color drained out of her face so fast it looked like someone had pulled a plug. That moment right there was 20 years in the making. And this is how it happened. My name is Zephira. I'm 36 years old, and I am a sitting high court judge in the state where I was born, raised, and eventually discarded. My parents, Arthur and Beatrice, built their entire identity around the concept of image. They weren't wealthy in the old money, quietly dignified sense. They were wealthy in the loud, committee-joining, award-collecting way, the kind of people whose names appear on plaques in hospital lobbies and who throw fundraising galas with a photographer present at all times. They called it their family brand. I'm not exaggerating that phrase. My father actually used it in conversation. The brand, the legacy, the image. I was an only child, and for 15 years, I played my part. Good grades, clean clothes, polished manners. I was the accessory that completed their picture of success. Then I made a mistake. I fell in love with the wrong boy at the wrong time. And I didn't catch it until a drugstore pregnancy test showed me 2 pink lines on a Tuesday afternoon in September. I was 16. I told my parents the truth, because I didn't know yet that honesty is a weapon some people will use against you. My mother sat at the kitchen table with her arms crossed and her eyes flat, not angry, not tearful, just flat, like a door that had already closed. My father stood behind her and paced. Neither of them raised their voice. That was somehow worse than screaming. Screaming means feeling. What they gave me was processing. A business decision. "You have embarrassed this family," my mother said. "You've made a choice that cannot coexist with who we are." My father set an envelope on the table. Inside was a check for $100 and a handwritten note that said, simply, "Do not contact us." They gave me a plastic grocery bag. I filled it with what I could reach: 2 shirts, a pair of jeans, a hoodie, my toothbrush. My mother didn't watch me pack. My father opened the front door and stood beside it until I walked through. The porch light clicked off behind me. I was 3 months pregnant. It was 40 degrees outside, and I had nowhere to go except one place, my grandmother's house, 3 miles away, on the other side of a town that was very much asleep. I walked all 3 miles. I didn't cry until I was halfway there. And then I cried until I couldn't anymore. And then I stopped, because I realized that crying wasn't going to keep me warm. My grandmother's name was Elowen. She was 71 years old, 5 feet 2 inches tall. And she ran a small vegetable stand on the edge of her property, because in her exact words, talking to people keeps me from becoming furniture. She was the kind of woman who had a cast iron skillet she'd owned for 40 years and an opinion about everything. And she delivered both with the same quiet, unhurried certainty. She opened her door before I even knocked. I don't know if she heard me on the porch, or if she just knew. She looked at me, the plastic bag, the red eyes, the coat that wasn't warm enough, and she stepped back to let me in without saying a single word about what had obviously happened. She made tea. She turned on the lamp in the guest room. She sat on the edge of the bed and said, "You are not alone. Not while I'm still drawing breath." That was it. No lecture about my choices. No performance of forgiveness. Just, "You are not alone," and she meant it in the most practical, immediate, logistical sense possible. There is a bed here. There is food here. There is someone here who will not leave. I lived with Elowen for the next 4 years. My son, Jacob, was born in May, in the county hospital, with Elowen holding my hand on the left side and a nurse I'd never met holding my right. I was 17 years old and I had never been more terrified or more clear-headed in my life. When they put him on my chest, I looked at him and I thought, I am not going to let anything in this world treat you the way I was just treated. I finished high school by correspondence, while Jacob slept in a second-hand crib Elowen found at a church sale. I enrolled in community college when he was 8 months old. I waitressed on weekends and mopped office floors 3 mornings a week before Jacob woke up. There were nights I fell asleep at Elowen's kitchen table with a textbook open and Jacob's baby monitor next to my ear, and she would come in around midnight and put a blanket over my shoulders without waking me. She never let me feel like a burden. That is a specific and rare kind of love, and I want to be precise about it. She didn't just help me survive. She helped me believe that surviving was worth the effort. Meanwhile, My parents were thriving. Arthur and Beatrice won a Regional Philanthropist of the Year award when I was 19. There was a photo in the local paper, the two of them in formal wear, holding a crystal trophy, smiling at the camera with their whole faces. I saw it at the library when I was printing out a financial aid application. I stared at it for a long time. Then I printed my application and went home. I didn't feel devastated. I felt determined in a way that had a very specific edge to it. They had decided I didn't deserve to exist in their world. I decided I would build a world they couldn't enter. I applied to law school when Jacob was 4 years old. I got in on a merit scholarship. I graduated in the top 8% of my class. I clerked for a federal judge for 2 years, then practiced family law for 6, then went through the appointment process, and was confirmed to the bench at 33, the youngest woman in the state to hold that position. I didn't do any of it to get back at them. I want to be honest about that. I did it because the law was the first system I encountered that didn't care who my parents were. It only cared what I could prove. That felt like oxygen to someone who had been quietly suffocating under the weight of other people's approval. But I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a small, steady flame in the back of my chest that had been burning since that October porch. It wasn't rage. It was patience. And patience, it turns out, is an extraordinarily effective weapon. Elowen passed away on a Tuesday in March, of natural causes, at the age of 88. She had been declining slowly for about a year, and she had used that year to put her affairs in perfect, meticulous order. Elowen had been a bookkeeper before she retired. She understood numbers and documentation the way some people understand music intuitively, structurally, beautifully. Her estate was valued at approximately $3,200,000. The house, the property, a modest investment portfolio, and the liquid cash she had built quietly over decades of careful living. She had no debt. She also had a plan. I learned the full scope of that plan at the attorney's office the week after the funeral. But before I even got there, Arthur and Beatrice had already arrived. They hadn't called me. They hadn't attended the service. Or if they had, I hadn't seen them. Because I was in the front row and they would have had to pass me to get to their seats. They showed up at the attorney's office 40 minutes early, dressed as if they were there to close a business acquisition. Which I suppose they were. When I walked in and sat down across the table from them, my father looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture someone has left in the wrong room. My mother didn't look at me at all. Arthur spoke first. He said that Elowen had been, in his words, clearly compromised in her final years, and that any documents she had signed recently should be considered subject to review. He said that the land, particularly the 12 wooded acres behind the house, was rightfully family property, and that he had already been in contact with a development firm about turning it into a luxury wellness retreat. He said, "You've had your time here, Zephira. The adults need to sort this out now." I let him finish. I let him believe, for about 90 seconds, that he was the most powerful person in the room. Then the attorney opened his folder and began to read. Elowen had structured her estate with extraordinary care. The house and property went to me outright, with no conditions. More importantly, 18 months before her death, she had established a payable on death account, a separate financial vehicle that bypasses probate entirely and transfers directly to the named beneficiary upon presentation of a death certificate. That account held $1,200,000. It had been in my name for over a year. I had already been to the bank. The funds had already transferred. Arthur's expression when the attorney finished reading was one of the more satisfying things I have ever witnessed. It moved through disbelief, then calculation, then fury. In about 4 seconds, my mother set her handbag down on the table very slowly, like she was afraid of what she might do if her hands weren't occupied. "This will be contested," my father said. "That's your right," I said. "I've already retained a forensic legal team, and I've secured private security for Jacob and for the property. But please take all the time you need." They filed the lawsuit that afternoon. They were going to regret it. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning 4 months later. My parents had hired Richard Hall, a genuinely talented attorney whose reputation in estate litigation was formidable and whose suits, as I mentioned, cost more than my first car. He was good. He was experienced. And he had no idea, when he shook my father's hand in the parking lot that morning, that he was walking into the worst professional moment of his career. I was not the presiding judge on this particular hearing. I want to be clear about that. I had, of course, recused myself from any case in which I had a personal interest. The judge assigned to the matter was a colleague I respected. I sat at the respondent's table as a private citizen, represented by my own attorney. But Richard Hall did know my name, and he knew it in a different context. He had a complex $50 million corporate merger case on the docket in my courtroom the following week. A case he had been preparing for months. A case that was extremely important to his clients. He didn't realize I was the Zephira in this case until he walked into the courtroom, got to the front of the aisle, and his eyes landed on me at the respondent's table. I watched him process it. It took about 3 seconds. His step slowed. His expression changed. He looked at his notes, then back at me. Then at my parents who were busy arranging their papers and didn't notice, and then at the floor. He excused himself. He walked to the back of the courtroom, called someone on his cell phone, spoke for about 90 seconds, and returned to the petitioner's table to quietly withdraw from the case. My parents were not pleased. The hearing proceeded with substitute counsel. Arthur took the stand and testified with a practiced, grieving solemnity that I recognized from every charity auction and community board meeting of my childhood. The voice of a man who has learned that emotion, when deployed correctly, is a persuasive tool. He told the court I had inserted myself into Elowen's life during her vulnerable final years, specifically to position myself for financial gain. Then Beatrice took the stand. She looked the judge in the eye. She spoke clearly and without hesitation. She said, "She was never our daughter in any meaningful sense. We severed those ties 20 years ago. She is a legal stranger to our family." She said it to discredit my relationship with Elowen. She said it to imply that I had no legitimate familial claim. No authentic connection, that I was, at best, a calculated opportunist, and at worst, a predator who had targeted an elderly woman. She did not know what she had just done. My attorney rose and introduced the concept of judicial estoppel, a legal doctrine that prevents a party from taking a position in court that directly contradicts a position they have previously benefited from. For 20 years, Arthur and Beatrice had filed their taxes claiming full family exemptions. They had transferred property under family trust provisions. They had used the legal classification of family member repeatedly, consistently, and profitably. By testifying under oath that I was a legal stranger, not their daughter in any recognized sense, they had created a direct, documented contradiction with 2 decades of tax filings and legal instruments. If I was never their daughter, those transactions were not family transfers. They were taxable events, and they had not been reported as such. My attorney placed a blue folder on the judge's bench. Inside that folder was 10 years of financial documentation, land transfers, capital gains classifications, offshore account records that told a story very different from the one Arthur and Beatrice had been telling the IRS. It was not information I had obtained through any illegal means. It was information that, once you knew where to look and had the legal standing to look, was accessible through entirely proper channels. The substitute attorney asked for a recess. It was granted. The recess lasted 40 minutes. When court reconvened, Arthur and Beatrice's legal team informed the court that the petitioners were withdrawing their claim in its entirety. The estate remained mine. I thought it was over. I should have known better. 3 days after the ruling, my home security system sent an alert to my phone at 11:14 inches the evening. Motion detected. Front property. Then, interior sensor. Library. I drove to the house myself. I want to explain why. Not because I was reckless, but because I knew with an absolute certainty I couldn't have fully articulated exactly who was in that library and exactly what she was looking for. Elowen had kept a handwritten ledger, a physical, leather-bound record book going back decades, in which she had documented every financial transaction she'd ever made. Loans to family members, repayment records, the careful notation of every dollar that had ever moved in or out of her hands. It was the kind of document that, in a legal context, constituted a primary source. It showed, among other things, that Arthur and Beatrice had borrowed substantial sums from Elowen over the years, sums they had never repaid, and had apparently long since reclassified in their own minds as gifts or inheritance advances. That ledger was court-ordered evidence, protected under the seal of the recent proceedings. Beatrice was standing in the middle of the library holding it when I walked in. She didn't hear me at first. She was flipping through pages with the focused, frantic energy of someone who knows they're running out of time. When I turned on the overhead light and she looked up, she screamed a short, sharp sound, and then her expression shifted into something that was trying very hard to look like indignation. "This is my mother's book," she said. "I'm not stealing it. I'm protecting family history." I didn't argue with her. I pointed to the small camera mounted in the upper corner of the room, the one that had been live streaming to a remote notary service since the moment the alert had gone to my phone. She followed my finger. She looked at the camera. She looked back at me. The ledger hit the hardwood floor. The sheriff's department arrived 11 minutes later. They were professional and thorough. They did not treat her as a founding family member. They treated her as a person who had broken into a residence and tampered with court-protected evidence, because that is what she was. She was handcuffed in the driveway under the motion sensor floodlights. Before the deputy guided her toward the car, she looked at me. The expression on her face was one I had not seen from her before, not fury, not contempt, but something unguarded and frightened. Something that looked, briefly, like the face of a person who has finally understood the consequences of their own actions. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. I held the door open until the squad car pulled down the driveway, and then I went back inside. picked up the ledger from the floor, and locked it in the fireproof safe in the back office. I made tea. I sat in Eloin's chair in the library. I looked at the window and thought about a cold October porch and a plastic grocery bag and $100 check, and then I went to sleep. For the first time in a very long time, I slept without any weight on me at all. The legal proceedings moved on their own schedule after that. Beatrice was convicted of felony breaking and entering and tampering with court-ordered evidence. She was sentenced to 30 months in state prison. Arthur, facing the tax fraud exposure the courtroom testimony had triggered, negotiated a federal plea agreement. The terms included 5 years of supervised probation and a restitution obligation of over $1 million in back taxes and financial penalties. The Legacy Society removed their names from its membership rolls before the indictment was formally filed. The people who had smiled at their fundraising photos and whispered about the pregnant girl 20 years ago quietly updated their social circles. That is what happens to a reputation built entirely on perception. When the perception shifts, there is nothing underneath to hold it up. 3 months into her sentence, I received a letter from Beatrice. It was written on institutional stationery. The handwriting was shaky. She said she was still my mother. She said she had done everything for the family. She asked how I could sleep at night knowing she was in there. I read it once. I sat with it for a moment, not out of guilt, but because I wanted to be honest with myself about what I felt. What I felt was nothing that required a response. I put the letter through the shredder. Not in anger. Just in finality. Jacob is finishing his freshman year of college. He is healthy, curious, and entirely himself. A person who grew up watching his mother study at a kitchen table at midnight and who drew his own conclusions about what effort looks like. He has my grandmother's eyes and, I think, her fundamental steadiness. On the wall of my judicial chambers, I keep a small framed object. It is not my law degree. It is not a photograph with any official. It is a plastic grocery bag, faded and old, the kind you'd carry home from a corner store, mounted in a simple black frame. My clerks have never asked about it, and I have never explained it, but I know what it means every time I look at it before I take the bench. It means I was sent away with nothing, and I built everything. I don't tell this story to settle a score. The score is settled. I tell it because I know there are people right now, today, who are standing on a figurative porch in the cold, holding a bag that contains everything they have left, wondering if the people who were supposed to love them are going to open the door. Sometimes they won't. Sometimes being cast out is the beginning of the only life that was ever actually yours. Walk toward the light in someone's window. Do the work. Trust the law. Trust time. You are not a liability. You are not a brand to be managed. You are a person. And your story is not finished. I am Zephyra. And for the first time in 20 years, I am completely, irreversibly free.